All right, today we're jumping back in time to the Middle Ages. But maybe not the part you're picturing. We're going to look at this incredible period of growth and confidence that was followed by a crisis so huge it completely changed the future of Europe forever. Really, the best way to get a handle on this era is to think of it as a story in two acts. First, you've got the good times from about the 11th to the 13th centuries. We can call it the Great Awakening. Europe is just booming. Cities are growing, trade is exploding, new ideas are everywhere. But then the 14th century hits and the second act begins, the Great Crisis. Suddenly, it's all about famine, plague, and war. The good times come to a sudden, terrifying end. It's a classic boom and bust story. So where did this amazing rebirth even start? Well, you might be surprised. It wasn't in a king's court or in some grand castle. Nope, it all started out in the fields. The whole story of this new Europe kicks off with a revolution in farming that changed literally everything. Get this, between the 11th and 13th centuries, the population of Europe pretty much doubled. So how on earth did that happen? Well, it was kind of like a perfect storm of good luck. The climate got a little warmer, which meant better and more reliable harvests. The constant invasions and raids had mostly stopped, so things were more peaceful. And all of that meant people had more and better food to eat, which made them healthier. But the real game changer, the big innovation that powered all of this, was something called the three-field system. It's a really simple idea, but it was absolutely brilliant. See, instead of farming half your land and letting the other half rest, you'd split it into three. One field for winter crops like wheat, another for spring crops like beans, and the third field, you'd let it rest and recover. This simple change meant way more food, healthier soil, and a backup harvest if one failed. And this is the part that changes the world. Because of these new farming tricks, farmers weren't just growing enough food for their own families anymore. For the first time, they had a surplus, extra food, that they could take to a market and sell. This one simple concept, extra stuff to sell, is about to unleash a wave of change. Okay, so you've got all this extra food, and with better farming, you don't need as many people working in the fields. So what happens? People start moving. They leave the countryside and head to towns and cities, which start to grow like crazy. It's the beginning of a whole new way of life. And these new, bustling cities created a totally new kind of person. They weren't nobles who got their power from owning land that had been in their family for ages, and they weren't peasants who were tied to working that land. No, these were the city dwellers, the bourgeoisie. Their power didn't come from land, it came from their skills, their work, and their money. But not all city dwellers were the same. You had a couple of different levels here. At the very top were the high bourgeoisie. Think of them as the super rich merchants and bankers, the people who were basically running the city. And then below them you had the petty bourgeoisie. These were your master craftsmen, your small shopkeepers, the skilled middle class that made the city run day to day. So what was life actually like in one of these new cities? Well, work was super organized. You had guilds, which were basically clubs for every trade, like bakers or blacksmiths, that controlled prices and made sure quality was high. Cities also got a lot of freedom. Kings would give them special charters that let them govern themselves. And they became these amazing hubs of knowledge, with the very first universities, like Oxford, popping up all over Europe. So you've got all this new money, new freedom, and these new centers of learning. What does that all add up to? It creates a really confident and ambitious new age. And you can see that confidence everywhere, in their politics, their ideas, and, most incredibly, in the spectacular art and architecture they created. And speaking of politics, this is where things get really interesting. See, for a long time, kings were actually pretty weak, and the real power was with all the local feudal lords. But now, kings made a brilliant move. They allied themselves with the rich new cities. The bourgeoisie gave the king tax money, and the king used that money to build armies and a government loyal only to him, making him way more powerful than any of the old lords. So, you have all this power, all this money, all this confidence. What do you do with it? You build something that shows it off, something epic. And the ultimate symbol of this era's ambition was the Gothic cathedral. They wanted to build churches that were taller and more filled with light than anything anyone had ever seen before. But how'd they pull it off? It was pure engineering genius. It really came down to three key breakthroughs that worked together like a stone skeleton. You had the pointed arch, which shot all the weight downwards instead of outwards. You had the ribbed vault for the ceiling, which made it way lighter. And then the coolest part, the flying buttress. It's like a big stone arm on the outside of the building, propping up the walls.
All this meant the walls didn't have to hold all the weight anymore, so they could be filled with massive, stunning stained glass windows.
And then the music stopped. The growth, the optimism, this golden age, it all came to a screeching halt. The 14th century arrived, and it was such a disaster that we now just call it the century of crisis.
And look, it wasn't just one bad thing. It was a terrifying cascade of disasters, one right after the other. First, the weather turned cold again, causing a massive famine. Then, a gigantic, century-long war kicked off between England and France. And just when Europe was at its most vulnerable, the deadliest plague in human history showed up at its door.
1/3. Let that number sink in. That's how much of the entire population of Europe was wiped out by the Black Death. 1 out of every 3 people. In some towns and cities, it was closer to half. It's a scale of death that is just almost impossible for us to wrap our heads around today. The world was turned completely upside down.
You just can't go through something like that without it changing the way you see the world. Art and culture became obsessed with death. You see this idea pop up everywhere, especially in art called the Dance of Death, which showed skeletons dancing with everyone from kings to popes to peasants. The message was clear. It doesn't matter who you are, the plague can get you. Death is the one thing that makes everyone equal.
But here's the crazy twist in the story. This horrible, tragic century of death. It wasn't just an ending. In a strange and violent way, it was also a new beginning. The crisis absolutely shattered the old medieval world, but from those ruins, something new and different began to grow. Think of the crisis as a giant, brutal filter that changed everything. The old feudal system, it completely broke down. Why? Because with so many workers dead, the peasants who survived could suddenly demand better pay and more freedom. Kings, meanwhile, used all the chaos to grab even more power. And as all the old rules and ideas crumbled, people started looking for new answers, which helped set the stage for the Renaissance. And that kind of brings us to a final big idea. The Black Death and the crisis of the 14th century were an unimaginable tragedy. But they forced society to completely rebuild itself, and that process eventually led to the modern world we know. So it makes you wonder, right? What are the huge challenges we're facing today that, as difficult as they are, might just be pushing us to create a very different and maybe even a better future?